Generative AI is reshaping search strategy. Schema markup offers hidden adventures. Technical SEOs face new challenges daily. How can structured data unlock Gen AI's full potential? According to a 2025 AI SEO statistics report, 64% of SEOs now use AI tools for keyword research and SEO tasks. Even more striking, AI algorithms are analyzing over 90% of global search queries. This shows the urgent need for structured data in the combination with AI strategies. Technical SEOs face new challenges daily. Search engines still demand precision. Structured data provides that precision. It ensures your AI-generated content is clear, connected, and crawlable. So how can SEOs best leverage AI and data? This is the Voice of the Search podcast. I'm Jordan Koene, and joining me today is Martha van Berkel, CEO at Schema App, which helps businesses leverage structured data for better search performance. Today, Martha will share how to optimize Gen AI content using structured data for superior search results. Martha, welcome to the Voice of the Search podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. Excited to be back.
Yes, you are one of our very fortunate and very select few return guests. And I'm so thrilled to have you back. And it's like the timing couldn't be better. This is like, we're at a critical crossroads. So much is changing in search. And I really want to dive right into our first question, which is how AI is evolving in the search landscape. And I really want to know from your lens and how you guys are working within data, how is generative AI changing the search landscape, and why is structured data becoming a critical component to this new environment?
So I always like to start with like how the consumer behavior has changed, right? Because I think that's the key piece, right? Like we used to go and put in, clunky keywords, right? And expect answers. Google then started, in the sort of early 2000s, bringing in sort of images and videos and like changing that piece. We are now in conversation mode, right? So the whole idea that we are just putting in words and expecting answers is gone. We're now sort of, there's thinking happening sort of as we sort of have these conversations, as we go deeper into topics, or as we choose, like as our intent changes, like as we learn something new. And the way I like to think about it is like the consumer has unlimited choice as to where they're going to discover information. And so we have to think then about like, well, where are those unlimited choice, right? So we'll focus on search, but social, I think, is sort of another kind of key area we should be thinking about. But today we'll talk about search. So search is happening like in the ChatGPTs and the Perplexities. And I think like that's going to even just evolve more. You and I have talked previously, on some panels where we talk about, how people are going to have like verticalized experience. Like what is the chatbot that's going to tell me about healthcare? And I'm going to, someone's going to have that vertical experience. So I think tons of choice. And so brands have to be thinking about like, how is their data going to show up in those experiences in an accurate way? They're not going to land on your website until they're converting. And so this is, again, where we think about search. We can't just, so we should primarily still be thinking about Google. They still have, that 89 to 93% kind of market share. ChatGPT is the one that's scaling. By the way, Bing is behind ChatGPT. Like, they're actually sort of a search kind of component to ChatGPT. How exactly that gets woven in, I'm still exploring and learning about. But then we have, these others kind of Perplexities and so forth. And so I really want SEOs to be thinking about data, right? This isn't about building a beautiful marketing website anymore. This is about making sure that the data on those websites is in the language of machines so that it can show up in those different experiences. And that's where structured data plays a role.
Let's talk about experience, because I think there's a huge disconnect between experiences and the experience of a user and understanding your audience and the user expectation, and then how this relates to data, right? I think many of us are still thinking UX design, those types of components. Tell us how you're seeing the integration of data to influence the expectation or the connection with users what are some, classic examples that you feel like we're just overlooking? Where's the opportunity here for SEOs to really unlock this opportunity?
So I think right now, like SEOs and content writers need to be working hand in hand. So that's one thing I think like where we used to be like, oh, like the content, like they'll sort of like sit over here. Like I am seeing in enterprise, like those teams coming closer and closer together. And I think that's actually good news. I think we're at a time right now where, and I'm sort of pausing because like we're still, the website is still the container of that data. And so the reason I mentioned content people is like we still right now need to put the content on the website. So we're still thinking about that experience from like who's coming to the website and who's interacting. They want less fluff though, right? So it's we're seeing sort of like things convert better. So the whole product led SEO and sort of thinking about conversion optimization on your website, I think is becoming more than an e-commerce thing. I'm hearing about it in healthcare. I'm hearing it in like
Yes.
big tech. So I think that's sort of a big change. So like, how do we think about making sure the content is still on the website? So the reason I say that is because the content then goes into a data layer. And then that's the data layer schema markup is like what's being consumed by these machines to do at scale. At some point, those things might deviate, right? At some point, we might be saying, actually, we're going to manage this data layer and it's going to have content. It's going to be tied to something in the user experience. Maybe they'll split like, but Google right now and sort of where we've historically seen this is like the user experience, because that's where you're going to send people and experience it, has to match what the data layer kind of thinks or what the structured data represents. So we'll see how that evolves. I do think we need to be thinking about, and this is something that I'm really excited about at Schema App, is that there's some timing things that got announced this past spring that I can't think is a coincidence. So this same week that all of a sudden Google stood on stage at this was at the New York Search Console event and was like, structured data is enabling Gen AI. Okay, so they haven't talked about structured data on stage and made a big deal about it pretty much since like November 2023 when we saw FAQ and that go away. There was a ton of
Right.
structured data announcements. They've been kind of quiet. Like I watch this stuff, like structured data is what we do every day.
Yeah.
Microsoft then the same week, Fabrice Cannell said the same thing. We're going to be using structured data. Now, I think it's because it helps them with accuracy. It helps them scale. When you do schema markup, you're actually building a knowledge graph, which is like data with context, different from LLMs.txt, which has no context, right? LLMs.txt is sort of like a really simplified version of your data. It doesn't
Yeah.
allow the inferring that large language models need to do. Now, that same week, Google, DeepMind, and OpenAI, who by the way uses Bing like as a data feed, announced that they're going to adopt MCP, Model Context Protocol. So this is a sort of standard that Anthropic brought out and said, we're going to sort of use this as like a standard way for you to kind of plug and play, into our large language model. And OpenAI and DeepMind, Google, basically were like, we're going to adopt this standard. Now, when we looked at the standard, it's like schema markup. Like it's actually like context, with data in triple. So if you actually do proper semantic schema markup, so what we do at Schema App, like converting that into MCP is easy. Okay, so when we think about how do we get our content right into these experiences at scale, with a data layer, like I do think we're going to see sort of this movement of structured data is actually going to enable us to then easily translate into the standard that's going to then allow sort of scale. And so we'll see sort of the big dogs, the ones who've done this at scale are the ones who are leading the charge here. Whether we see Perplexity and others kind of go that way, I think is, we'll see. So that's our, like, I do think like content is still key, but the context, that is what you have to do in the structured data, is that element that I would say like the LLMs.txt don't solve and is where the power of inferencing and the effectiveness of inferencing happens. I don't know if I answered your question, Jordan, but that's like where my brain goes.
Well, no, not only did you answer my question, you actually gave a lot more context that I was looking for in my next question, which is like what specifically is happening with data that's most valuable for generative AI. And I want to keep working off of this because I think MCP is a concept that is largely like still underdeveloped, underdiscovered in terms of what it means in integrating this universal framework to connect LLMs with your data sources and your information. And so I want to just start by asking you the question, like, what is it that makes MCP useful? Like practically speaking, why will guidelines and frameworks or protocols like MCP be so critical to the SEOs and the web developers and the brands and businesses that want to be seen in LLMs?
So we work with a lot of enterprise clients, and we've been talking to them for about 5 years about reusing their structured data or their knowledge graph in order to enhance AI initiatives, chatbots, on-site search, you name it. And I'm finding that even, and like these are big, like, you can see who our customers are, like even the most senior architects like aren't used to using knowledge graph technology. Knowledge graph technology has been around for a long, long time. In fact, my CTO just got back from a knowledge graph conference, and knowledge graphs, like Gartner called out in last year, like knowledge graphs and generative AI are the critical components to scaling and getting kind of accuracy in this AI world. And so I see sort of MCP playing a connector role to structured data and knowledge graphs to allow ease of use and ease of adoption. Because like if they can't consume the data easily, and again, I'm wearing my like architect hat now, right? Like I'm a data architect. Like the CIO's biggest challenge is having data readiness, like to accelerate these AI and large language models initiatives. So if we can kind of think of, okay, we have all this structured data, or Google has all this structured data, Microsoft has all this structured data. Ryan Levering, who's like basically is the advocate for structured data at Google. I did follow up with him after the New York Search Console and asked him like, to what extent are they using
Yeah.
structured data and in what pillars of your business? And he was like, I don't know. Now, part of me thinks if they can build like one feed of like a common standard way that then all of these services that need to train and infer, from how all of a sudden have this data feed, that makes so much sense. Like if you, I don't know, I run a software company. Like to me, this is a data pipeline. This makes so much sense.
Right.
And
Right.
it's standardized that everyone can plug and play. So now all of a sudden, I don't care if people know how to do a Sparkle query on a knowledge graph, which is typically like what would be required in order to get the value from the structured data that's stored in a knowledge graph. All of a sudden, like if there's these automatic, it's like the API world. Like, so for those of you that
Right.
were around in the 2010s, my job at Cisco was to open the APIs to all of our services data.
Yeah.
We're sort of doing the same thing now. But SEOs, like think of this as like, what can you unlock? When I talk about like the three kind of value areas of schema markup, like the first is around SEO, right? Bringing context to rich results, helping us get AIOs, helping us drive non-branded queries, contents in the middle. The third one is around AI and unlocking that value. And Vertex on-site search from Google, MCP is like, they're going to actually use that. So I do like, that's why I think it's actually a really exciting moment. And where I think Google's going to do and Microsoft's going to do a lot of this work where you build structured data, this standard, it's going to go into their standard and it's going to power these experiences.
I want to keep going on this topic around structured data and schema, and then ultimately like how we can use protocols like MCP in our strategy, because there's this fundamental reality that is we're going to need more guidelines. We're going to need more direction in order to help all of these models ingest and consume our data in our web pages for that matter. I mean, fundamentally speaking, there isn't enough capital and enough resources in the world for every single one of these AI companies, OpenAI and the likes, to go out and build the infrastructure that Google has built. Google has the biggest, most sophisticated infrastructure.
Which is why ChatGPT is using Bing, right? Because
yes, exactly.
It like
exactly.
why the cost of actually doing the inferencing is very, very high. And so in some of their documentation, they're talking about like, so we'll search Bing, right? And then kind of do sort of a smaller processing. So they're already kind of thinking about those efficiencies.
Correct. Not to say that the new ChatGPT search and the new ChatGPT Chrome extension is useful. That's a whole different conversation around selection for consumers.
Yes.
But the reality here is that there's a great need for structure to help enable these platforms to get access to all the things we have, or at least a prioritization of what we have. So my question on this is, we're recording a week before Google I/O. What do you think's coming? What types of announcements do you think are coming in this week ahead of Google I/O, and the best platform that Google has to give not only the SEO community but the entire Google community some context as to how they want to consume and access data and information?
Well, I know they're not going to do an API for structured data because I asked Ryan Levering the question and he said they're not ready to do that. So I don't expect that to be what's coming out. You know, I'm going to answer your question from Google I/O, but like I need to share something else that you got me thinking of in the
Sure.
earlier
Yeah,
part of
please.
your
Yeah,
conversation.
absolutely.
One of the shifts we have to think about, and I feel like I've been talking about this for a decade. So people think about the requirements of like from Google on like how to get a rich result, right? And it's like, I'm going to optimize these bare minimum things, right? On a product, on a service page, etc. Like we've got to get out of that bare minimum MVP because in order to articulate our content semantically and holistically, like we aren't just like hitting the bare minimum. Like we need to explain what the whole page is about and what all the elements are, what are the topics on it. Like we need to make it as easy and as clear. So I think that's like a shift SEOs need to think about is like rich results are like, yes, they still drive higher click-through rate. They're actually performing really, really well. But like if we're going to get the benefit to the large language models to use it for inferencing, we have to go deeper. Like today on schema.org, there's like 800 different types. Google has like 40 types that they call out. And like they're only like touching on 10% of the properties for each one. So I guess think about like depth and accuracy is as sort of like, I think that's a shift we need to think about if we're going to truly build that data layer that's going to inform and instruct large language models. Okay, so that's like one piece. So do I think Google is going to tell you to do that? Maybe. Like that would be a way for them to make their lives easier. I think Google I/O, like I'm hoping they talk about more about how they're going to get Gemini in front of more people. Like, so I think, I don't know, there was something I read recently that they're likely going to put it like in some elements of search or YouTube. We use Google sort of desktop and like Gmail and so forth. To me, like that will be really interesting from a search perspective because it's going to be like, there's going to be a ton of learning on, you know, what are people talking about? And this kind of comes to another shift that I think SEOs, we're kind of in the middle of right now where we're still thinking about keywords, right?
Yep.
Remember when I talked about like the consumer isn't searching for keywords anymore, right? So we're fooling ourselves if we think how we do audits on keywords and how we're planning content, like that needs to change drastically right now. So entities are kind of like, what are the topics? So we need to kind of think broader than keywords, like, and we need to think about like topic coverage on our website. So this is that, remember I said there were 3 values, SEO, content, and AI. Like this is that content piece that like, I think is going to get very, very disrupted. Now, I would love Google to be like, hey, we're going to, stop giving you query data and we're going to give you topic data. Like that would be amazing. That would like make my day out of Google I/O. I don't think they're ready for that yet. I think as they put Gemini in front of more people, they'll get a better sense of that. But like we as SEOs, like, and this is again, Schema App's like kind of working on this, right? Like how do we tell you what entities and topics are on your site? And how do we kind of give you an idea and a framework? But I think like that gap of like getting us from keywords to entities, like that's, I would think like the urgent need for us to do in the SEO community now. But what will Google tell us to do? I don't know, it'd be really fun if they came out with requirements like they've done with rich results to say like, this is what needs to be in your data in order to, be almost like a technical SEO requirements, but it's like, Gen AI, like Gemini requirements. Like I actually think that would be very helpful. And I think it's going to tie to structured data and it's going to tie to sort of like how you make things, super easy to crawl or super easy to actually give your data, right? So like if they make MCP connectors, at what point are we just going to be like, great, give us the feed? I think it happened too close to IO. Like they have to plan way far ahead. So maybe that's next year's IO, but I think that would be interesting if they're thinking like that to say like, how do we produce data? The piece that I think is interesting is, how are they going to replace that old handshake we had where we give you content and you give us clicks? I think like, are they going to make a new contract with all of us with regards to how that's going to evolve. That would be, and how are they going to frame it? They're the big dogs, so they're the ones who are going to call the shots. It's not going to be like we have a say in this, but media has actually had funny story. Google reached out to me directly through our support channel. Love this. And was
Okay.
like, could you guys support this if we add it to schema.org? So this was like 2020, probably 2019, 2020. And it was around a licensing property for media. So the media teams were looking for a licensing piece. So it's already built into schema.org since 2020.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's my pontification on what we might hear and the direction they might need to go.
I want to add one more caveat to this topic, which is, just this past month in the antitrust lawsuit with Google, one of their engineers was giving testimony and basically stipulated that a overwhelming majority of Google's rankings are handcrafted, and that was the exact word used, handcrafted, right?
Wow.
And he talked about like DeepMind and certain other aspects that are automated and are part of the core algorithm system, but that there's still a significant amount of Google that is kind of handcrafted or yielded by engineers, and that engineers can influence the changing in rankings within these parts of the environment. So the question I have for you is, this is as recent as just April 2025. How are you feeling about the components of search results being handcrafted, and how should we as operators think about implementation of what we put out to Google, whether it be in the traditional sitemap, web page strategy, or how we're talking about now the future of concepts like frameworks like MCP and protocols that feed data into LLMs and AI? How do we prioritize?
All right, this is like for sure just my opinion, but I think about how Google makes money, right? So if we think of my brain goes to like, there's people deciding, right, what gets shown, right? That's that the data point you just shared. And if that's the case, my question is why? Like, why are they doing that? And is it because they still want to be thoughtful about how that maps with ads, right? Like, are they still being, and so is there a stipulation of who's spending on ads that's going into that? That's sort of like part of where my brain goes. Now you could automate that because you know how much ad spend people have and so forth.
Sure.
The other piece is like what's driving people to stay in search. Like we've seen, I would say, lots of evidence in Google AIO that like they're, want it to be self-reflective. That's my nice way of putting it.
Right.
Yeah. That we're seeing like such a huge number. I don't know. There was a data point shared. I think it was like over 50% of like links in AIOs in this latest version, kind of April timeframe, May timeframe, are pointing back to Google. And so part of me is like, well, what's the content then that enables that? Is sort of like where I'm like, are they trying to prioritize some of that so that they're getting sort of more kind of visibility in? The whole question just starting with like, why would they kind of be manually ranking that piece? So part of me is like, how do we be strategic about, I don't know, this is like anti sort of how business is optimized, right? So I think of like business, right? Like I'm holding these two truths in my mind at the same time.
But you have to realize for the better part of 20 years, the mission behind Google was more is better, right? Like the mission has always been like feed Google your content, organize it in these things called sitemaps. There are a couple other ways that they organize this too, but like generally speaking, it was feed more. But the reality is that we're embarking on a whole new frontier where feed more probably isn't going to work effectively if we have a multi-channel environment for discovery. If consumer discovery is going to change, and it's not just Google, and even within Google, it's segmented to multiple experiences, feed more isn't going to work.
No, I think it's like feed quality and feed uniqueness, I think is going to be like the key piece. And I would say like the organization or the content that I'm hearing perform like in our enterprise is like not generalized, not kind of, even Gen AI generated, that's like not unique. It's like that unique perspective, like all this EAT stuff we've been talking about now for years, right? That with sort of like context of the business and like elements of the business. And so this is again where like, what are the topics that you really need to be an authority on in order to stand out? And it's not quantity. It's not like I can publish this many blogs. It's like really deep, rich content that's unique, that's not out there in the world in any other way. And I think that's the part that's hard. I think the other piece that's really interesting is I think of my brain just went to social and like how LinkedIn content is now showing up in search, and how it's individuals versus company kind of articles like that are coming up. And I think that's sort of when we think of strategy, like, thinking of like, where are all these elements? So it's unique content, and is it again hosted on the website, or is it hosted
Right.
on other pieces that have their own kind of connected data and kind of elements and linking, right? Like when you tag people in it, when you refer to other articles, so to me, that's like where we're seeing like those kind of goes to the very first point of like, how are we thinking of our data and where it's all connected and how it's coming out, but unique, deep content by experts, like that's what I'm seeing perform. And that's, I think, what we need to insert into the machine, and then make sure, again, that data layer, like that piece of it's like, are they articulating and consuming it easily?
All right. My last kind of deep dive in terms of how we're going through these questions is really around building an actionable framework. How can our SEOs, the web community, the web development community, really take clear steps to provide clear, actionable data to both search engines and generative AI LLM models to perform better in discovery?
So I'll talk about structured data because that's like what I see really work. So one is like structured data starts with structure on the website. So I think let's talk about like web developers and people thinking about like, so, um, machines love structure. And so if you think of like a templated site, like those of you that use AEM and pull random components in all the time and just let marketers like go wild, like that's hard for the machines to understand. So, having some structure as they crawl your site and understand it. And that goes at the very beginning of like web development, right? Your content then is like the piece that goes in that. So like think about, really clear content, this whole like lots of words to just like marketing isms that don't mean anything to anyone and that we all skim through because we're trying to get to like, what do you actually sell? Or, what is this doctor, like what services do they actually, what's their expertise? What can they solve? Like we need to get to that really clear, articulate, content that then is in that structured way, because then the machines can get what they need and then they understand it. And then the last piece then is like that structured data. So how are you thinking about not just optimizing a page, but connecting the dots across your site? And this is where like the IT people I talk to, where they're like, well, I can add schema markup on this product page. And I was like, great, but like, how are you connecting the dots to that rich content we just talked about that's super deep and super specific? Like you need that content to, be talking about that product and connecting those dots, very clearly. Is it mentioning it? Is it about that product? Is it recommending that product? As an example.
One of the things that I really feel is critical, especially for websites that have been around a while, is the cleanup journey, is the removal of like things that are not useful anymore still in play when it comes to data. For example,
I think so. I
okay,
think so.
good. Yeah, please jump in.
Yeah. So, I'm seeing our clients do this, right? Where it's like, let's sit back and say, like, healthcare is a great example because they used to all have the same content, like what is melanoma, like what is heart disease, right? So all that's
Yeah.
gone, right? And again, like now they're thinking about their websites and like, what are the, specific service lines? Like what is the medical things that we solve? And like, how do we articulate, not just who this physician is, but like what surgeries they do and like what specialties do they like work on in context of like what hospital they practice at. So I am seeing people think about like what is core to answering that consumer question and where does that data live? And we also think about like if there's I call it a thing, but like a topic or, an entity, right? Like if there's a thing that you want to be an expert and known for, there should be an entity home. Like what is the one web page that you want people to go to that talk about that thing? And I would say like that's when we do a lens of like cleanup. It's like often it's on like a million places. And so again, if you're a robot and you're like, which is the page that is most authoritatively talking about this topic from this brand that I like, because I think they're connected. Like that should be an entity home. There should be like one page that talks
Yes.
about that. And so this is sort of like, I joked, I was like, category pages might come back, which is like an interesting product kind of piece. But like, there should be a page that talks about like, we specialize in, I don't know, I always use like, I love like organic cotton dresses, right? Like I want to know that from that brand, and it's like handmade in Canada, and I can like get it and it ship, like all those things.
Right.
So
Yeah.
how do we really think differently about, again, like we still have to think about the consumer, but I think we need to think about like authoritative kind of content,
Yes.
articulating like what we're experts in, and not like general stuff like women's clothing or,
Right.
like really, really specific. And this I think is going to make, actually, this is a new thought I've just like never had, but like, I think it's going to force businesses to get really clear on what they're good at and what they do and what they don't do, which is actually really exciting, right?
100% agree.
Which may be driving, actually, so Canada's oldest department store, okay? This is like, Hudson's Bay. Like it's been around since like we, like the founding of Canada is going out of business. But they don't actually. No, it is.
Don't worry. I think we're following suit. I think JCPenney's is just trying to come back to life. But
Thank you for giving me a great U.S. example. But if you think about it, like the department store is this generic place that we go to buy underwear, right?
Yep.
Like let's be honest.
Yeah.
And now we can go to specialty stores that make really great underwear that's like tailored for like whatever we're looking for.
Exactly.
And so I think like that's a great example of how the consumer behavior is changing. We can find super niche, very specific things at our using voice while driving the car, right?
Yes.
And this kind of takes us really back to the very first thing I said, right? So like, if we need to then figure out how we're going to show up in that voice search as I'm driving my kids to hockey practice or ringette practice, like we better make sure our content is talking about those specifics so that they find us and that they see like our brand as an authority. So I think this all then comes to like web content. Like this is why I think content and SEO is so tied. And then IT will play a role in just like, how are you enabling that data to get out to those people? And again, I think structured data is what we're seeing the big like the two big players, Microsoft and Google, lean towards.
And I just want to add this. We don't have to debate it, but I think I want to add this, which is like today where we are within this generative AI and these response-based search experiences is that categorically or information-wise, they're really good at providing us some direction. And we're only going to get more and more specific. We're going to get down to the individual person entity. So think of the doctor and what that doctor specializes at this particular hospital and his years or her years of experience and capabilities. Like we're going to get to that level of granularity and responses. We're not there yet, at least not effectively. And so I think that's why this whole topic of data is such a critical one for us to get good at now so we can answer that in the future.
Yeah, and you can do that with structured data. Like that's when you do it semantically and connect the dots. I think the other piece is it's going to know us personally too, right? Because we can give it context. So imagine a personalized search journey on whatever platform I want. And then at what point are we going back to APIs? Like I'm not even buying it. Like ChatGPT just announced their product search. Google has been doing a ton of work, right? Where you can like literally like you're just pushing the buy button. You're just converting on the website. So conversion optimization, I think, is maybe the new SEO.
Yep, absolutely. So
whoa, booyah.
Segueing to our lightning round. I'm going to ask you some very specific questions, and want to give me your kind of your overall view on these, and we'll jump through each of these lightning round questions.
All right,
quickly. Let's go. Buy or sell? Are you buying or selling that structured data will become mandatory for ranking and AI generated results in 2025?
I'm buying that, and I think they're going to demand, well, I buy that that's going to be like the trend because it's going to make it cheaper. And I think they're going to run into challenges around sort of making money and making it make sense to do that much compute power. And so just like usual, they're going to put the burden on us.
Yeah, 100% agree. Yep, it's got to come, and it's got to come sooner than later. Crystal ball. We're looking into the future now, Martha. Tell me how the relationship between structured data and generative AI will evolve over the next 18 months?
I think this is why MCP was such an interesting topic. Like, I think we're going to basically use structured data as the feed into the models. And it's going to become like even less of like just an SEO thing. And it's going to become like, this is like your data strategy for LLMs. So I think, but we're going to have to just like journey on that. Like, I would say like, we're still pretty early days in that. I'm excited because we're going to like make that happen.
Absolutely. I agree. Frameworks and protocols are going to be a way for us to organize and structure better, because none of these models, and we don't know if these models will verticalize themselves or they'll become super critical for certain types of consumers. As that happens, we have to be very prudent about what we supply. And I think these frameworks and models are going to be critical over the next 18 months.
Can I add a piece to this? I
Yeah,
think it's
please.
going to be data feeds with context.
And
And I say that very specifically because I don't know, I read like 4 articles this week where it's like you LLM.text, like that's not going to be good enough, right? The
yep,
reason why all the research says knowledge graphs and large language models work well is because it's data with context. So it's structured data, think that broad concept, but it has context, which means you're defining relationships between things. Because it's when those relationships are defined that you can do inferencing. And the problem we're solving for large language models is the inferencing part. That's the expensive part, right? It's the part that hallucinates. And so I think like historically, if you'd asked me a year ago, I'd be like, enterprise are going to be investing in knowledge graphs. I think like as we have new standards, like that's hard to do. And we're seeing people still do that work. But I think the most important, the reason why knowledge graphs are important, because it's data with context.
that's right. Absolutely. Trend or trash? Will using AI to automatically generate schema markup at scale be a trend or trash?
Well, I obviously think it's trash because I think like part of it is I think it's like anything. Like I think Gen AI is good at creating drafts. I think they'll be good at creating a good start for a page, but I don't think they're going to be good to sort of understand the nuance of what the business wants to articulate and sort of like connect the dots with, right? Like the business concept of like I'm looking for, the human is saying I'm looking for a physician who speaks Spanish, who knows about Lyme disease, who practices within 5 miles of my house, and by the way has an appointment available on Tuesday. Like
Wait,
we're the ones that understand the nuances of the type of questions that the humans are going to ask.
yes.
And
Yep.
the data isn't just data, right? Like the data is to answer questions for humans. So I think like we're still going to have to be using our brains and saying like, okay, that's great. That's like how the minimum viable piece, but like how do I want to create those relationships? I don't think it's going to be able to necessarily define all those relationships. Can we use AI to help us then define how those relationships should be defined? Absolutely. Like anything that's sort of like a specific task, like AI is good at. But I think like if you're thinking of this is my data model, like this is my knowledge graph and how I want my business understood, like there's going to be some crafting that has to be done with that. So I think that's trashy.
All right. Hey, I love that. That's a great response. All right, this next one is going to be hard. I know it's going to be hard, and I apologize in advance, Martha.
All right, bring it.
What's the word? Give me one word that describes the current state of search in the Gen AI era.
Today.
Oh,
No, like, oh, that was my question. You want it today? Like you want it like what the
yeah,
SEO
yes.
is today with
That's
Gen AI?
today. Yes,
I'm
today.
going to say behind.
Oh, interesting. Behind. Okay. Why is it behind? What makes it behind?
I just think I'm hearing too few SEOs questioning how we do things. Similar to the examples I gave
And
earlier, like they're still doing keyword research and they're not asking, how do I think more broadly than that? I think we're still reacting and saying like, oh shoot, like my clicks are down. Well, like no shit, Sherlock. Like of course your clicks are down because like this world is. So I like while I do believe there's lots of thought leaders and lots of people writing amazing things, I would say the majority of SEOs are still being too tactical in how they're thinking about SEOs. Now, I think we're like in that evolution to where I would say like I've been so impressed with how our customers are like we're seeing more collaboration, more people from cross like functions joining these conversations to figure out how we sort of move them from old world to new world and like get the players at the table like content, like data architects, etc. But I would say like, Schema App's leading them there, right? Like if we
Yeah.
weren't behind, they would be pulling me there. And, so excited for me. I love innovation. I love sort of helping people future proof. Like that's my je ne sais quoi, like raison d'etre kind of thing. But I don't think I would say the majority and not just SEOs are behind, like the executives are behind because
Yes.
they're thinking
Yes.
that the metrics they set last year, they can just add 10% and that's going to happen this year. Bad news, like that's
Nope.
just not how the world works. And like, is this why we're seeing so much change like in marketers and in digital
Yeah.
teams? And
Yeah.
I actually don't think it's their fault because like it's a bit of a dumpster fire right now. Like we don't have the data. So we need to kind of be walking through that journey. And frankly, like this is literally what I talk to my team about is like we need to build those steps to take people on this journey from like how we're thinking and researching content to where this is going and how do we use data to do that. So that's why I say behind. I think like unless like everyone is again getting a cross-functional group of people, putting together to educate their executives on how this changed. Last week I spoke at the healthcare conference for physician strategy, and I had an SVP sit on a panel in the first session and be like, Google, Gemini, and ChatGPT is our new homepage. Like this is what's happening with this data search. And she was talking about zero clicks and how that's, we have to do structured data. And I was like, who is this SVP and how is she so informed? But she was unique. And so
Very unique. Yes.
so I guess that's my point is like, we need to be managing up, we need to be managing forward, and we need to be like getting more collaborative around the table.
100%. Couldn't agree more. That is a well said concept behind what's the word. So next one up, toss up. Last but not least, our toss up question is, would you choose to invest in comprehensive data cleanup or AI content expansion for AI rankings if you had limited resources?
So my brain goes to like, what would drive the highest quality of data? Because that's sort of what we were talking about is like putting it in. So I'd probably do the data cleanup first.
Okay, tell us why. Tell us why.
I think as people as organizations think about like how do I update content or like what my content or even like what is the like breadth of what I have today, like in order to think about, let's go back to like my question of like, do you understand whether you talk about the topics and the entities across your site? I think today their sites are bloated with content that doesn't matter and is irrelevant. And so as we go on that journey to understand like where you're at today, I think starting with a clean slate. Now I'd like to do both, Jordan. And then at the same time, identify like one area that you're really is important to the business and start building that like really deep knowledge, high quality content that's like ready for Gen AI, but like really that's also ready for your consumers. And so I think like if you're doing the cleanup and you're investing in very specific content, not volume, but like high quality, like that's sort of where I would go. So I would say like do the cleanup first, and then you at least know where you're at. So you know where to make that investment in the future.
Absolutely. Totally agree. There is a cleanup work that always has to happen first. Maybe that's just my human nature on things, but I absolutely think that that's the first step.
Yeah, I just don't think you'll know where you're actually at with regards to authority. Like if you don't actually know if you have good stuff to start with, right?
That's right. Absolutely. And that wraps up this episode of the Voices Search podcast. A big thank you to Martha van Berkel from Schema App for joining us. If you'd like to connect with Martha, you can find a link to her LinkedIn profile in our show notes or on thevoicessearch.com. For more information about Schema App, visit schemaapp.com. If you haven't subscribed yet and want a daily stream of SEO and content marketing knowledge in your podcast feed, hit the subscribe button in your podcast app or on YouTube, and we'll be back in your feed soon. Okay, that's all for today. But until next time, remember, the answers are always in the data.